Hey guys, so today I wanted to give a rundown of what I found to be a pretty simple LCR setup. Lets you craft any recipe you could ever want in a single LCR. The general idea just runs on basically the same logic you would use when automating a single block with AE and throwing blocking mode on the interface. Now, just to run through what we have a few variables defined. Now storage, this is going to be the one that has all of our tanks on here. These are the tanks that are going to be storing our inputs as well as our outputs. Now you could definitely separate them in some ways, but I think it's convenient to have them all together. See, I have things like chlorine on the input, then I have things like carbon monoxide, which is being made. All of those are on the storage variable. Now F input, this is where I'm dictating the inputs of the fluid inputs to the machine. In that case, I'm actually just using super tanks. Now, the reason I'm using super tanks is because input hatches are pretty limited in their inputs. It benefits pretty greatly to run large batches in this, as I'll explain a little bit later. So having that extra large buffer before the input is a game changer. Now, I don't exactly want to break this at the moment, but if I hold control, you can see that there is just a pump between them. That's just so we can get the fluids in there. The next thing we have is the item input. Same idea, except it goes for this input bus here. Now I could definitely do the same thing and throw like a chest above it with a conveyor, but I just found that generally the batches of items aren't that huge, so especially just for the testing purposes, a single bus is fine. C input, that's going to be the circuit input. This is a different bus that you're going to want to dictate that is special for the circuits. The reason we have a circuit input bus is because this is actually meant to be built in a way in which it can handle every circuit integration. Now you see here, this is actually a super bus. That's just because I am on an old version of New Horizons. I don't know if it shows here. Yeah, I'm only on 2107. So I don't have the ability to pull from input buses yet. But I believe currently you can just swap this out for a normal input bus as long as you're allowed to pull from it. Then outputs, that's going to be these output tanks here, and this output chest here. Now, if you were doing recipes that, say, had like 4 or 5 fluid outputs, you'd probably want more, but again, just for testing, I only have the 3 here. Works fine. The final thing is circuits. This is these drawers here that are keyed and typed to specific circuit integrations. Here we're doing integration 1, here we're doing integration 2. The reason I have them on a variable is just to make it a little bit easier when I'm pulling the circuit out of the machine here to make sure to get it into the drawer. And they're keyed so we can just push to all of them at the same time, not have to tell it which drawer we want to push to, and it'll put the circuit in the right drawer. Alright, now with the variables out of the way, we can delve a little bit into the code. You'll see I have this outputs group in the beginning. This one's incredibly simple. Just pulls from that outputs that we dictated. This is the item side of things, and then we output to our storage. And then we do the same thing for fluids. Input from outputs again, and then output here right back to storage. Very simple. This is just to get the outputs out of the machine. And I do it at the beginning, just because you'll see that the way we set up the recipes, when a single recipe is run, it actually ends the flow. So it's a good idea to get those outputs out of the way instead of needing to branch off of the ends of all those flows. Now that's a good segue to get us into this recipes group. And there's a little bit more going on here. Each of these things does have a bit of logic inside of it. But the beginning is very simple. This redstone condition is actually what's going to be running our blocking mode-esque logic. Now I just have a single redstone node, and I'm just checking if it has any signal. And on a false, we do all of our logic. Now you'll see I have a redstone receiver here, and I can't show you because it's right behind it, but we have just an input hatch right there, and that input hatch has a redstone, I can actually show you here, it has a fluid detector on it set to normal. And what that's going to do is if there's even 1 liter inside of this, it's going to give us some redstone signal. And by picking up that signal, we can determine if the machine has fluid inputs or not. Now, if we were doing more item recipes, I would also do something to chain this onto just an item condition to check the item inputs, can actually go ahead and do that pretty easily. We would go ahead and do something like item input, check for presence of items. On a false and on another false, we run everything. Nice. Now, how do we actually set up the recipes? Well, first, just want to run through these last two inputs and outputs. This one here is going to be inputting from that circuit input, and it's going to be outputting to those circuit drawers, as we showed in the last variable. That is the logic to clear the circuit input when we're going to run another recipe. So you'll see that the circuit inputs are actually defined within the recipe. So here, for example, we choose to input the integration 2 circuit, and we input that right into that circuit bus. And what we want is when we're running another recipe, we want to actually clear that circuit so we can swap in another one and do a different recipe. Now, the last bit of code here is where it gets a little bit complicated, and that's where we're doing the actual recipe logic. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a wonderful way to define these in something like AE, and instead you kind of need to do them in SFM. Now, especially early game, not too bad. Mid game, still not too bad. What I like to do is create something like this, a recipe base. And inside of that, I'll put all of the logic that you could need, and that'll let me copy this group, change a few things, maybe delete some stuff, and get a new recipe up and running pretty fast. Now, the things that we're going to put in here are this first condition, say fluid condition. I call it needed. It's basically the one that checks if you need to run the recipe. Now, if you were doing, let's say, a recipe that made items instead of a fluid, you would just swap this out for an item condition. It will check your storage variable, and here's where you will define what you want that output to be. And then you put some amount, and if it returns a false, that means you don't have that amount. That means you want to craft it. Now we have ingredients I and ingredients F. These are very simply checking our storage to see if we have the things that we need to make it. Now, something to note, I'll go over this a little bit later too, but it's important for this setup here to actually check if you have a little bit more than the amount to run the recipe. Now, the reason for that is because the way that we set up that outputs here, none of these are actually filtered, and we're just pushing to all of them at the same time. So we kind of get an issue where if our if our super tank runs out of fluid, it's not going to be technically like typed to that fluid anymore. So if we make an output here, that's going to just be pushed to the first tank. And if that tank is empty, well, now it has a fluid in it that maybe we didn't exactly want. Now, one way that we can go about this is by using these like fluid filter covers, but I find that they aren't the best. And in general, I just like this way, and then we can use something like fluid AE to get things in and out of these, like for the rest of our base. Now, the next part of this recipe base that we're going to go through, we have the inputs. Now, this input is the item input. This is where you would define the exact amount of items that you want to pull. For items, I like to use drawers that have been keyed. That way we get only the items we need, and we don't pull the wrong items, and we don't push the wrong items. Input fluids, same thing, pulls from storage, just like how items here pulls from storage. And we would go ahead and define in the whitelist what things we want. Circuit input, same idea, I believe, yeah, not set here, but you would set it to, let's say, my integration 1 circuit or int 2, whichever one you need. I have it set up here, so when I copy it, it specifies to only pull one item. That's so we just get that one circuit in the input bus. Now, output, this one's actually really simple. These don't ever really need to be edited. The output first is set with a fuzzy detection on the program circuit. That's going right into the circuit bus. Then we have the output for the items going into the item input, and then the output for the fluids going into the fluid input. Now, if we look at some of these guys, we see I have an example set up here. This one is for titanium tetrachloride. I'm personally a big fan of using it as a test. Now, 900 buckets. This is telling it to keep crafting it until there's 900 buckets in the buffer here. Now, if we look at the ingredients, fluids, as well as the input, we'll notice something interesting. This is where I was talking about having it a little bit higher than what's actually in the recipe. Now, when I have it set to need 129 but only pull 128, what that's going to do is make sure that there's always one bucket left in there, so the tank is only able to accept chlorine as an input. That way we wouldn't end up just putting the wrong fluid in the wrong tank. Then we have the outputs, and those aren't set to anything. They just go to the buses and, the drawers and the tanks that are on the white variable. Oh, sorry, the other variables, my bad. These are the inputs on the machine. Now, if I want to go and test it, we can see I have this tank here with 928 buckets of titanium tetrachloride. We also have this tank here, which has some chlorine, and these drawers giving the item inputs. Now, if I want to, I can go ahead and pull some of that out, and we will see, bam, machine turns on. Gonna run a few recipes, actually pulled quite a bit from it, but it'll keep running those recipes until this tank gets to one more recipe. It'll go over the 900, and just like that, machine's off, things are empty, it knows it doesn't need to craft anymore. Now, if we look over here, I set one other recipe up, the recipe base, and this is to do molten polyethylene. Now, same thing, we have a check to see if we have the amount. I just did 128 buckets for this. Ingredients, similar thing where we actually check a little bit more. I wanted to do a batch of 64 in this, so each thing is going to pull the amount for 64 recipes, but on this ingredients check, we actually check for a little bit more. Now, it doesn't exactly matter how much more you check for. Like this, I did 100 milliliters more. On the oxygen, I did 1 milliliter more, or 1 liter. Doesn't really matter. Up to you. Circuit. Now, this one actually does use a circuit, so I input from the integration 2 chest. And out here, we will output to that circuit bus. Now, just to show you that things are working very well, let's see, this can hold 128 liters. I actually want to pull one with a little bit, that should be okay. So we have titanium tetrachloride there, and we have polyethylene here. So I should be able to suck that one up. Oh, actually, it makes quite a lot. So unfortunately, I'm going to need to suck up one more of these and one of these. And there goes crafting that polyethylene. And now there goes crafting that titanium tetrachloride. And what that was there to show you is that it's not going to try to mix recipes, because we have that redstone receiver on there with the blocking logic at the middle with this condition. It's never going to try to craft two recipes at the same time, and it's never going to be mixing those inputs. So finally, I thought it would be kind of nice to just set up a quick little demonstration of adding a new recipe. Now, a personal favorite of mine is hydrogen fluoride, because it is super easy, and it takes 2 ingredients and it makes a 3rd fluid. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and grab some inputs. Here we have the hydrogen flasks, and we should be able to see in here that, oh, I guess not. Let's grab some of those nice fluorine cells. Nice. And if we look at hydrofluoric acid in the LCR integration 1, so this one is going to be using a circuit, then just a bucket, and a bucket makes a bucket. Very simple. So what I can go ahead and do, take this first tank, just throw a lot of hydrogen in there. Second tank, let's just throw a lot of fluorine in there. Now we can go over here and we can dupe that recipe base. Now in here we're going to set up that needed. This is where we check if we have our output. I'm just going to make 128 buckets, keep it simple. Now this is where it gets a little kind of customized depending on the recipe. There's no item input, so I'm just going to delete the item. I'm going to delete this item input, and I'm going to delete this item output. Now for these, this is where we check if we have everything that we need. I'm going to do a batch of 128 buckets each. So in that case, we find the hydrogen, and we say that we're going to want 129. Just a nice number that's a little bit higher than 128. You can grab that fluorine, set the fluorine also to 129. Very nice. Connect that false. The false, of course, because we only want to run when we have less than our output. Input liters, this is where we set the actual amount. Hydrogen set to 128 buckets. And of course, can't spell today. Fluorine, oh, no. Fluorine down here. Set that also to 128 buckets. Nice. Have our 2 inputs. Then we can go ahead and do the circuit. Now we want an integration 1 for this recipe. So I just click that, very easy. And that is all I have to do. Now we'll see that nothing's happening yet, but as soon as I go ahead and I attach that up, we should get, oh, my mistake. Final thing you're going to have to do is actually add those new tanks that you placed onto the main storage variable. Now the way I have this set up, all of the tank inputs are storage tank 2s, which make it easy to just go ahead and type that in, and you can just select all. Bam, they're on. Hydrogen in there, fluorine in there, and just like that, crafting it up. Gonna make a pretty good amount. Then it's all out. We look over here, and just like that, 128 liters hydrofluoric acid. Pretty easy. Gonna keep this stock that we set, and it's gonna keep going. Now, I can already hear some of those lovely comments, such as, but Olaf, I need many LCRs. I make a lot of them because I need the speed of a lot of them. And that's actually an incredibly good and very valid point. The LCR caps at 1 tick, and you're going to hit that pretty quickly, especially in the later tiers. So, what do you do about that? Well, in my next video, I'm going to go over a little bit of a way to kind of set this up for parallel processing. A way that you can keep all of these single recipe definitions, but set it up in a way in which it'll run for, let's say, 8, 16, 64 LCRs, however many you want to throw on there. And they'll run perfectly in parallel. Adding a recipe will be just as easy. You just copy that thing over, write in the recipes, just add a little logic to it. And it's not super difficult. I've actually pretty much worked it out. It's just a question of setting it up here. It's going to run pretty similarly to my assembly line parallel recipe, in which it uses a little bit of counting with some drawers to store variable numbers and use that to dictate what machine it's working on. Iterate through them, check which one's full, check which one's empty, throw a recipe in there. Should be pretty easy to do. Now, there's a second issue I do want to address, and if anyone picked up on this, props to you. This is something I definitely didn't notice in my first run on this, not something I noticed when I was setting it up, but something I definitely noticed a little bit down the line. And that is related to how the machine works when dealing with multiple recipes. Now, you might not exactly know what I mean, but if we look at the titanium tetrachloride recipe, for example, if I pull some of this stuff out, you're going to notice it takes a few recipes for it to reach that capacity. And one thing you'll notice is in between those recipes, the machine fully shuts off. Now, that might not sound like the biggest problem, but if you look, we're only getting an uptime of about 50%. You know, half the time it's on, half the time it's off. Not great. You know, ideally, if we're trying to craft a lot of recipes, we want the machine to be running all the time. If we have all the inputs, why not run it? That is a lot easier said than done. The reason for that is we need a way in which when this thing, not even exactly that, but we need a way in which when that that input hatch, or all of these input hatches empty, we need to essentially get all the inputs for another recipe in like the exact tick that that thing empties. And that is incredibly difficult to do. One thing that you can kind of try We have this redstone receiver set up here, and we can set up a trigger on the top level, and we can set that trigger to be redstone controlled instead. And that does give us a little bit of extra speed. It'll essentially more or less run on the tick that redstone signal updates. But the issue there is that the fluid detectors, they don't always update on the exact same tick that the hatch empties. It seems like they poll every like 3 to 4 ticks maybe. So you might hit in the right window, you might not. Now the other issue is based on how these tanks work. If you notice, they have pumps in between them. And what do pumps mean? Well, it's going to take a tick for that fluid to get in there. So even if we could detect that the fluid was emptied on the same tick, run all of our logic, push the recipes on that same tick, they still wouldn't end up in the input hatches on the same tick. It would take one extra tick. Now, is it possible to fix? Yes, definitely. Through a pretty similar method to my parallel setup, actually, you can use these drawers to count and store variables. Do something like iterate through all of your tank inputs, for example. Say, oh, first tank, and also use it to iterate through these input hatches. So generally, I like to start with the hatches, iterate through the hatches. For each hatch, check, not even check, sorry. For each hatch, pull from our recipes that we need, push the fluid to the hatch, then push the fluid to the tank variables. But then you're going to have to use some like variables to kind of count which tank you're trying to link to. You know, like once you get to, let's say, the fourth fluid over here, you want to make sure that you're pushing to the fourth hatch, but then also to the fourth auxiliary tank. And that gets a little complicated if, let's say that like you start with a fluid that is going to fill this tank, and then you get to a fluid that isn't going to fill the tank, then you get back to a fluid that is going to fill the tank. You know, you can't just push to all of these and hope that it gets the ordering right. You have to actually keep track of that ordering yourself. Has some issues, not the best. So if anyone has some ideas on how to tackle that problem, I would love to hear them. That's honestly been something I've been toying with for quite a while now. I still have no good solution. I have a solution that might work in theory, but relies on a lot of things going really well and a lot of things that I don't think would ever actually go really well. Another possible idea I had was to actually kind of set the recipes up in increments of ticks. So we noticed that in here, when I set up a recipe, we can really define how many times it's going to run. You know, by giving it, oh, sorry, wrong thing, by giving it 100 and, or in this case, 900 buckets of titanium tetrachloride, we know, sorry, wrong side, by giving it 128 liters of chlorine, we know that we're going to run it, I believe that's 32 times. And we know 32, if each one's going to take a tick, that's 32 ticks. We could possibly scale it down to, let's say, 20 ticks. So we know that it'll run, it'll take a second to do everything, then on that next second, it'll see, oh, hey, hatches are all empty, good to go. The issue I'm running into with that, one, really annoying to make sure that when you're setting everything up, one, you get all the proportions right, you get them in a pretty high batch size, and two, that batch size is something that's actually going to be relevant and something that's going to be in increments of a second. Kind of an issue, not great. Also has some issues with the startup time. You know, when you run that first recipe, it's not going to be the same as when you run that recipe when the machine is running. You know, you push the first one in, takes a little bit for it to turn on. Kind of some problems. So, moral of the story, if anyone has some idea on fucking how to get this fucking machine set up in a way in which it doesn't shut off, I would be so grateful to hear that. But until then, I think this is a pretty good setup. Definitely works, you know, EV, IV, honestly I've used it, like LUV, early ZPM, works perfectly fine. Just up-tiering those LCRs with higher tier hatches and running some in parallel, pretty good. Keeps a lot of your things stocked pretty well. Anyway, anyone got any comments? Let me know. Feel free to let me know what you think of the design. Definitely would love anyone's tips on improving something, you know, making something a little better, a little faster, a little easier to set up, would love to hear it. But I've definitely put a bit of work into this, and this seems to be about the best I can come up with. So, until my next video, catch you later. Have fun with the pack.